Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Basify Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Locals, Twitter, and Telegram, all contained in the description box of this video. In addition to Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee, both of which are linked in the description box. This episode will plan to be around 40-45 minutes. At the end, super chats will be read first, and any other chats will be read as time permits. Also, this will be the last fantasy stream for a while. I'll get into more details as to that a little bit later on my YouTube community post. But as I said, this will be the last one for a while. So what got me thinking about this? Well, while we wait for people to file in, and we see that we have Rito, Hainer, Euthanasia, Minoan, and Zero World. Hello. So, no, I didn't watch it 5 years ago. But about 5 years ago, Shadiversity, Shad, did some videos on, did fantasy get right the weapons that fantasy races would use? He does more than orcs, dwarves, and elves, but I wanted to limit it to the big three. You could have included hobbits, but they're not really fighters, and Tolkien doesn't really have them fight either. Now, obviously, within the fantasy setting of the modern times, Tolkien sets the foundation for all this. Obviously, the meta has moved, and so I will primarily be assuming that the Tolkien standards, though of course there will be some differences because again the meta has moved, but ultimately I'll ground it in Tolkien's work. Whereas what Shad was trying to do in comparing these different races was the idea of, well, we got Tolkien, we got Blizzard, we got World of Warcraft, we got all these other fantasy genres. Like, what common denominator can we find across all those? Well, that gets really difficult because a lot of them contradict with each other, and so you're just going to have to pick one that makes sense. And Tolkien makes sense primarily because it's more consistent, and because it's more consistent, I'm going to prioritize that, broadly speaking, over these others. Another thing too, and I'll get to this a little bit later, Shad said, well, elves are basically humans but better without a weakness. And I'm like, well, they do have a weakness, and it's something that he doesn't get into because he's not using Tolkien's elves, he's using this amalgamated elves. Elves use a K-selection reproductive strategy, so they're going to be generally outnumbered. That's why elves have to be so good from a lore perspective, but I'll get to that in a moment. So what this episode is going to basically break down is, so how did Tolkien envision these races initially, and what were their fighting styles, and so on and so on. How does Shad tackle it, and then how do I view this? So we'll start with the dwarves. Broadly speaking, Tolkien states the dwarves are short, around 4 feet, 4.5 feet, stronger than men. In fact, he states they're the strongest of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. And in the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, they're primarily using axes and farming implements to fight. So specifically in the Hobbit, they're a mattock, which is a farming implement. And that's about it. We don't really see dwarves using ranged weapons. We don't really see dwarves using swords. Thorin uses a sword, and that was considered to be unusual for a dwarf. I don't remember if Tolkien says dwarves use spears. They probably did, but he primarily focuses on axes and mattocks. Now, what Shad argues for his amalgamation for dwarves is that dwarves are shorter than men, but as strong. So he's not taking the Tolkien route exactly, because for Tolkien, they're stronger than men. He argues that dwarves would be great with range, primarily crossbows, due to short arms, unable to draw a bow, or maybe smaller bows made from composite material or steel for a greater draw weight at the shorter length. Given the dwarven strength, they should be able to do that. But see, that would only make sense if dwarves were stronger than men, right? Because if they were as strong as men, they'd have the same limitations that a man does. He argues that dwarves would use poleaxes and halberds as well as two-handed swords such as falchions. This is where we're going to see a lot of, I think, the weaknesses of Shad's analysis here, is because he's a practitioner of HEMA, historical European martial arts. They have a focus on individual one-on-one combat, and while certainly in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, often the material spring from which fantasy comes, there were individual combats, but primarily in fantasy, where you have war, you're not having individuals dueling. You're having large armies being mustered and fighting each other. And so what might be the case for a duel will not be the case for a conflict on a wide scale in a fantasy setting. So I think that that's problematic. So what I'll say about Tolkien is, and Shad, is given that dwarves are short And in ancient and medieval fighting, especially with melee weapons, height and reach are the number one advantage. The most obvious weapon for a dwarf is a spear and a pike. Because a pike, for example, the Macedonian sarissa was, I think, 18 feet. So given that dwarves are stronger than men, even though they're shorter, that should make it easier for them to use pikes. So what we would expect to see is it's really quite surprising that Tolkien doesn't actually give dwarves something to reach out and touch somebody. Now, that could possibly be why dwarves got stomped outside of Erebor by the Easterlings, because they were tall men with swords and spears. They could presumably outreach the dwarves, and that's probably why the dwarves were handled so roughly. I think Shad is just wrong. They wouldn't be using swords, at least not against elves and men, or Uruks, because they're too short. And I'll get into a little bit of that later. So for me, looking what I'm thinking of, using basically Tolkien's template, dwarves are shorter than men and elves, but stronger. So they're gonna compensate for their height with pole arms and missile weapons. So I foresee the dwarves using spear and pike formations to engage with enemies. Given that the push of pike's endurance is key, who can outlast the other in the fight is the winner. The dwarves have an obvious advantage in strength and endurance. They would be peerless in such an engagement. They would use bows. Now, C.S. Lewis, in The Last Battle and in Prince Caspian, makes dwarves archers. Now, when I first read that a couple of years ago, I was like, oh, come on, Lewis. Really? But actually, Lewis is right. That's exactly what dwarves would be doing, given that they're stronger than men, but shorter. That would be a way for them to reach out and touch somebody to negate the height disadvantage. And again, I don't think dwarves would be using crossbows. They'd be using bows. As we saw in the 100 Years' War between England and France, for every one crossbow bolt fired by a trained Genoese bowman, you could have 7 arrows from a British longbowman. So I think the dwarves would prefer the rate of fire of a bow to a crossbow. And they can make composite bows or bows out of some sort of synthetic metal like steel, or in the fantasy setting mithril, so they could pull it back and then have a much higher strength of draw weight in a smaller package so that their arms wouldn't be at a disadvantage. So in that regard, the dwarves rather than the elves might be the ultimate archers, just because they could deliver arrows with a greater punch because they could pull a greater weight, being the strongest of all the free peoples. So the other thing is, given their propensity for digging, and along with their native strength, I believe the dwarves would be masters of the fortified camp. They'd be digging trenches, erecting palisades, constructing breastworks, and building forts. One would see that the dwarves would sally out in a campaign. They would, like the Romans, always construct a fortified camp. Dwarves are not fast either. They have short legs. And unless you posit some sort of fantasy creature for them to ride, which Tolkien does not do, in fact, most fantasy genres don't do, they'd be limited to their how fast they can march. And so building these fortified camps would be a must in order to drive away superior or more mobile forces. This would in turn make dwarves very difficult to surprise and attack in a camp. With this defensive mindset, we might also see dwarves using their supply wagons like the Goths and Hussites as mobile forts. So while this didn't technically happen out west, you can all think of the old fashioned westerns where you circle the wagon train around and defend from an Indian attack. Something very much like that did happen in South Africa against the Zulu by the Afrikaners. So you might see something like that with the dwarves, where the spearmen would defend against the direct assault and the archers, and given the dwarven penchant for craftsmanship, maybe even mobile siege weapons like ballistas, which the Romans used as well, could defend these fortified camps. So due to their proficiency in digging and stubbornness, dwarves would be excellent besiegers. They could dig walls of circumvallation, or not walls, trenches of circumvallation around a city or fort. And the main thing to make that work is persistence, and the dwarves are very persistent. So they could likely have the willpower and the gumption to stick around to starve that enemy out. The dwarves would likely plan their battles to be fought near mountains, as in the Battle of Five Armies, and natural bottlenecks, such as Helm's Deep, to compress the numbers of a superior foe, or to make dwarven-made bottlenecks, such as trenches and breastworks, in order to funnel a larger force into a smaller kill zone. Being relatively small in number, this would be their best bet. I do not see dwarves using shorter weapons, such as swords, axes, daggers, etc., since against taller foes, they would be at such a disadvantage, it would make no sense. With one caveat, fighting orcs, whether in a tunnel or out of a tunnel, orcs being the same height as dwarves, there's no compensation necessary. In that case, non-polar melee weapons could be expected. And in that case, for example, Shad's argument against dwarves using axes would disappear, because against a peer-sized opponent, of course you'd use axes, because why not? They're good at cracking through armor. So if orcs are wearing armor, you'd use axes. Presumably they could also use swords, but that would only be against, a peer-sized opponent like orcs. Given that, say Uruk-hai or men would be much taller than them, I don't see them using that as their primary weapon. And then again, unless we posit some fantasy beast for dwarves to ride, I do not see dwarves having a strong representation in cavalry. Again, another reason for them to use polearms, which are a natural counter to cavalry. So basically, what I foresee is a dwarven force would be slow. It would be very heavily armed. It would be primarily revolving around polearms and missile weapons. Excellent in besieging and entrenchments. And again, why is this? Well, one is, of course, the native traits of the dwarves. But so in nature, we have two kinds of breeding strategies. There's the R selection reproduction strategy, which you have lots of offspring with little investment. So you could sort of view that as the human wave attack. Rodents tend to do that. K selection is few offspring, high levels of investment. You see that with birds and higher mammals. And so in that regard, dwarves definitely fall into the K selection strategy. Tolkien says that at most only a third of the dwarven population is breeding. They spend the rest of their time fighting and mining. So that being the case, they're going to also be very meticulous in their planning and cautious in combat, because, for every orc loss, that's no loss to the orcs. They can just breed 100 more. For every dwarf loss, that's a big loss. And so a more defensive perspective, along with superior planning and logistics, would be crucial to a dwarvish war strategy. Now for Tolkien, we're going to the orcs. There's basically the orcs and then the Uruk-hai. So the orcs are around the same size as dwarves, around 4 or 4.5 feet. Uruk-hai are taller but shorter than men. So let's say 5'8", 5'9", 5'10". They're not as tall as the tallest men, like the men of Numenor or Gondor. The difference between mostly the Uruks and the orcs is orcs are taller and can fight in daylight. So we'll start with the orcs. For Tolkien, the orcs were like giant great apes. In fact, in the Battle of Helm's Deep, he gives an account of an orc flinging himself at Aragorn, which is he's described in terms of a great ape. They tend to be as strong as men. They tend to breed a lot. So there's going to be a lot of orcs at any given time. So they're going to rely on numbers more than anything else. They're cunning, but not terribly intelligent. They're not going to have a grand campaign. That's of course why they tend to be led by the Dark Lord, because he's the man with the plan, basically. And in Tolkien, they have scimitars. Usually, they fight dirty. They can be poisoned. They use bows as well. Spears. This is a great orc. So Uruk spears Frodo in the Mines of Moria, which Aragorn said would have killed a wild boar had Frodo not had the mithril coat. So in that regard, that's more or less how Tolkien treats the orcs. The Uruk-hai primarily use bows because they're man-sized or near man-sized, so they can use the great bow, like the men of the Woodlands and the men of Gondor. So we see that. Now, for Shad, he is kind of conflating the orcs and the Uruk-hai, and I'm not really a huge fan of that. But okay, that's what he's doing. He's more, I think, inspired by the orcs of Warcraft and Blizzard, and I'm not a fan of those either, for reasons of consistency and other things. He claims they're taller and stronger than men, are very aggressive, so he assumes they'll be like shock troops. So he assumes they'll be using poleaxes, dane axes, and maces. Orcs, he assumed they'll be great bowmen, the warbow, greater range and penetration. So that's consistent with Tolkien's Uruk-hai, so that's not different. He doesn't believe they'd use swords other than as backup. He believes orcs would, because they're so warlike, would be... His argument on that was that swords were typically a backup weapon. And you might have it for dueling purposes in peacetime. But if you're in a very warlike society where you expect actual combat with your own kind most of the time, you'd have a different set of weapons and armor around with you. That was his argument. Now, I don't like that sort of use of the orcs. They're not taller and stronger than men. They're not Uruk-hai, and I don't like Blizzard's use of the orcs. In large part because thematically, for Tolkien, the orc was a corruption of the elf. If you made orcs good, they'd be elves. They wouldn't be orcs. So, I know why he does it, because Blizzard's really popular, Warcraft's really popular, but I don't like that. So for me, though, again, using the broadly Tolkien-esque framework, like dwarves, orcs are short in roughly 4.5 feet. In order to close the distance with men and elves, and this is more so for orcs, because dwarves presumably won't be fighting elves and only be fighting evil men, they would use a polearm. So I could see orcish spearmen and pikemen in a phalanx formation in vast hordes to overwhelm their foe. So in many ways, they rely on speed because they're smaller and lighter and faster. They're not as stocky and heavy as dwarves. In which case, you might kind of envision a less disciplined version of the Swiss pikemen, who moved very rapidly and decisively. So, for example, at the Battle of Nancy in 1476, they surprised the forces of the Burgundians and completely routed them before they had even prepared their defenses. Now, obviously, I don't expect orcs to be as crack troops as the Swiss, but I do expect a kind of like attack in column with like pikes and spears as their, especially in overwhelming numbers, as their sort of like mobile strategy. Against shorter races such as dwarves and hobbits, we could see, again, a preference for non-pole arms, such as swords, daggers, maces, and etc. And of course, Tolkien, for them, they use scimitars. Being weaker than dwarves, but near as strong as men, orcs could use shorter but more powerful bows to harass enemies as the dwarves. So the difference is their bows would be weaker than the dwarves, but not the men, because unlike dwarves, orcs have very long arms. Tolkien describes them as having very long arms, like a great ape's. So in that regard, their height disadvantage does not necessarily mean they can't draw the length of a human bow. So they could still be, crack archers. Well, they wouldn't have to be crack. They'd just be a lot of them, right? For like a dwarf or any one elf, there'd be like 100 orcs in the worst case scenario. So you'd really be outnumbered in many of these cases. And so it'd be sort of like the Persians at Thermopylae when they told Leonidas they'd blot out the sun. That's kind of what we're talking about here with the orcs, is the way I'm envisioning it. And we might also see them use crossbows and slings. Slings take very little effort less effort than say a bow or crossbow to make and to shoot with. So we could see that. And crossbows, given that Tolkien and other, in this case, I think other sources are consistent with this, that the dwarves are tinkerers and would create things. So maybe even crossbows. But again, I still think that given the rate of fire and the ease of use, the bow would be preferred. I wouldn't be surprised if there were crossbows and slings as well. Orcs are more numerous. Again, they take the R selection strategy, so you're going to have lots of orcs, and they're not going to care about meticulous planning and being careful, because there's more where they came from. It's kind of the whole, Eastern Front, Soviet Union cannon fodder strategy. There's more where they came from. You don't need to think too hard about this. So they rely on speed and would disperse their forces into autonomous packets of raiders and then congregate for a major engagement, which is called swarming tactics. We've seen this in real life with the steppe nomads in the ancient medieval period and the Native Americans on the woodlands of North America, where you have independent bands that then are within marching distance of each other, and they're sort of like screening each other, and then when they find an enemy, they all assemble and surround it to annihilate it. And I think that's sort of the strategy the orcs would pursue. And given that Tolkien himself said the orcs had a mongoloid look, sort of modeling them off of the men of the East, I think that's not too dissimilar from the sort of source material as well. They would not be great in sieges in the sense of being, meticulous planners and organizers like, say, a dwarf, but they'd be great for cannon fodder to fill up the trenches. And you might use them to, just overwhelm the enemy on a wide front, as we saw Saruman did at Helm's Deep. At a certain point, to quote Stalin, quantity has a quality all its own. But the better troops would be like the men, the Uruks, and the trolls. Given their size, they could ride wolves and wargs. I think I'll stick with that trope from Tolkien down to the present. That seems to work for me. This would give them a great level of situational awareness, with light cavalry screening their advance at gaining intelligence, which would actually put them in an advantage against dwarves, because orcs riding wolves could better able to gather intelligence. Now, being that they're corrupted elves, they're still inferior to elves in many regards, but given that elves are known for having keen eyesight, Legolas is known for having keen eyesight in the Fellowship of the Rings, it's quite likely orcs could see quite well, maybe even better than men, maybe even better than dwarves. So you could imagine these wolf riders, gaining intelligence, giving them a leg up on the dwarves, which they would need given the dwarves' other advantages. Orcs fight dirty. Their blades, arrow tips, and spear tips you could expect to be dipped in poison, dung, and other offal to poison and wound an opponent even with a flesh wound. If that were the case, what we would then expect to see is their opponents wearing essentially a kind of silken under armor. So one of the things the Mongols did when they realized that they could get, even if their armor, their laminar, which is the laminar armor plates could be penetrated by enemy arrows and go deep inside of them. If they had a silken undershirt, that would, even though the arrow pushed into the flesh, it would not penetrate the undershirt. So it could be pulled out. And if the arrow was poisoned and it didn't penetrate the undershirt, it wouldn't poison the soldier. So we could see, elves and men developing similar countermeasures. Also, I'll mention the Uruk-hai or Uruks. They're larger than orcs and smaller than men, so they would fight in a fashion similar to men. And in that regards, I don't really need to say a whole lot, because we all sort of know intuitively throughout ancient and medieval history how men can organize and fight. In fact, that'll take way too long to go into all the possible permutations we could see there. But what the Uruk-hai would add to an orc horde is two things they lack: shock troops and siege engineers. They could be encased in heavy armor, so I guess this sort of goes back to Shad's point, with axes or swords or maces, and just crash into enemy formation and break it up. And then operate siege engines, because they're generally more intelligent. The Uruk-hai are more intelligent than orcs. They're stronger than orcs. They could and more disciplined than orcs. So in the Two Towers, when they're carrying Merry and Pippin to Isengard, it's the orcs that are causing trouble that start the fight, and the Uruk-hai are on the mission. So they might have the wherewithal to actually build the siege engines and dig the trenches, or at least force the orcs to dig trenches and then make the siege. So they would be, I think, a potent component of an orcish warband. The elves. Now, in Tolkien's Middle-earth, most people are familiar with the elves from, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, we don't really see the elves fighting except Legolas, and he's a archer from Mirkwood. Now, in The Hobbit, we see the elves fighting, and they're primarily spearmen and swordsmen with some archers. So at the Battle of Five Armies, it's primarily spearmen and swordsmen with some archers. But if you go to the Silmarillion, elves fight in a whole host of fashions. There is mention of some mounted elves on horseback, but it's not really explored in any great detail. Elves tend to fight in Tolkien's mind, a sort of shield wall formation, sort of what you've seen in medieval Europe with spears and swords. That tends to be the perspective. And so in the fifth great battle against Morgoth, Turgon of Gondolin marched out with 10,000 men with swords and spears fighting in the shield wall formation. Again, they're not generally mounted in Tolkien's work, though there's one or two references, but not many. And again, they have superior eyesight. They're superior to humans in almost every way. Though some humans can be stronger. For example, Turin Turambar was stronger than most elves. He was a unique human in that regard. So they're generally stronger than humans. Again, they have a weakness, and that's something that I think the problem with Shad was he conflated too many different elf groups. Is their case selection for reproductive strategy, so that elves are going to have not very many. And in fact, for Tolkien, there's a kind of a kill switch. After they live a sufficient amount of time, and they have a sufficient amount of offspring. I mean, they're immortal after all, right? Their sex drive just turns off. And so at a certain point, the elves apparently can't reproduce after a certain point, in which case things get really dicey if they lose too many elves in a battle. So again, they're really, really good, but. So according to Shad, they have good eyesight. They're more agile. They're weaker than humans. That's probably his worst take in the whole series. I mean, I don't know really any fantasy genre that says elves are weaker than humans. Least of all Tolkien's. Shad agrees with the norm of elvish hardiness. Shad argues elves have no limitation. I kind of mentioned that. Elves can use all weapons that humans do, just better. He argues that elves with better eyesight would have a synergy with archery, especially in low light environments like the night. He argues that elves would, because of their superior coordination, would fight with dual weapons, rapier and dagger. And again, this is the weakness of Shad's analysis. There's very little, while there is some individual combat, champion to champion, throughout antiquity, throughout the Middle Ages, that's not the norm. The reason why we don't see dual wielding in history is because you need a shield, you need armor. Okay, so if you don't wear a shield, you're not going to carry two weapons. You're going to carry a two-handed weapon. Those are just the norms, and I think that's his weaker take. He's better with the dwarves, a little bit worse with the orcs, and pretty bad with the elves, is what I'd say. So for me, going back to a broadly Tolkien-esque perspective, this is what I'd say for the elves. Elves have an affinity with flora and fauna, being able to basically, throughout the Lord of the Rings, the elves say they spoke to the trees, they awakened the trees, and they can get along with animals very well. So what surprised me, right, not just in Tolkien's work, but in all fantasy since then, is the lack of elven cavalry. Given that one of the most important things you have to have when you ride a horse is bonding with the horse. It's one of the most important things you have to do if you're mounted at all, whether you're a warrior or not. And given that elves basically have like this racial hack of being able to talk to animals, they could have this almost like, mind meld with the horse, and they could literally be acting as one. So I'm not surprised. I'm surprised elves aren't treated as the greatest equestrians in any fantasy world, because they would be, because it would come easy to them, and they're immortal. So unless they get killed in combat or die from disease, they could just have century upon century to perfect the art of horseback riding. They'd eventually be able to put the Mongols in their shame. So that, I think, is the key thing that I see elves doing that most fantasy doesn't. Elves would be the greatest knights in the fantasy world. They'd win all the tournaments. They would run their enemies into the ground, they would be doing like Theoden style Rohan charges all over the place. And they'd be pretty much unstoppable because they're just going to be that good. Now, given also that elves have a penchant for archery, you could see a combination of, on the one hand, horse archers as well as lancers. So the classic nomad matchup of like archers and lancers. So archers soften up the enemy target, and then the lancers ride in and defeat them. That's a tactical formation I think the elves are naturally fitted to, given all of their unique racial traits. And again, I'm surprised we hardly ever see this expressed in fantasy settings. Also, because of their case selection reproductive strategy, elves would be more cautious. So like the dwarves, I'd see them forming fortified camps, maybe not as rigorous. Being faster than dwarves, elves could actually more easily get around, so they don't need to necessarily invest as much in camps, but they would probably still invest in some. Like orcs, their horsemen could form a screen for scouts to gather intelligence and also deny intelligence to other people as well. So, they could drive away the orc wolf riders and then deny them intelligence instead of being the ones spied on. They would probably only engage in a fight if they had the upper hand in crushing the enemy or necessity forced their hands. I think in a lot of ways, elves would fight like Hannibal. So whoever had watched my on hiatus history of warfare with terminal philosophy, we covered a lot about the Second Punic War. And what we talked about Hannibal was he preferred the indirect method rather than taking on the Romans directly. He'd always prefer feints, flanking maneuvers, passing through impassable terrain like the Alps, attempting to apply maximum force at the point of contact when the enemy is weakest, rather than attritional slugfests, which you might find to be more the case with like dwarves, men, and orcs. Given their keen eyesight, elves would make crack marksmen, especially in low-light environments such as dense woods or evening. Given that elves are immortal and prodigiously intelligent, they would make great craftsmen, rivaling the dwarves, and excellent warriors too. If they lived, say 100 years, how much battle experience could you acquire? How much mastery over craftsmanship could you have over these compounding centuries? well, far more than any human, and far more than probably any dwarf. Of course, the question is how many of you'd still be alive, given that you don't reproduce that often. That's the trade-off, of course. Elves might not be excellent besiegers. They do not make machines or contrivances such as men, orcs, and dwarves do. You don't really see elves making things like that in the Lord of the Rings, and I think that that's because elves are more they more represent like a spirit of nature or this natural essence, and so they don't really have a lot of these constructs. And in that regard, I don't think elves would make great besiegers, but they could make great stealth warriors, such as ninjas or assassins, being able to infiltrate positions of strength and kill selected targets. Especially given the fact that if you go back to the Lord of the Rings, they have those coats given to the hobbits, which allow them to pass unseen in many cases. So that gives them an advantage in that regard. So, sort of in summary to all this, from my perspective, I think that the dwarves and the elves, because they pursue a case selection reproductive strategy, while they are obviously more competent than men in many areas, would be much more cautious than men and orcs because they can't afford losses. And if necessity forced them to fight unprepared and they took horrible losses, that would be a serious blow. Men are sort of between orcs and dwarves. I mean, men in fantasy tend to be more case selection as well, but not quite as hyper focused as dwarves and elves. They tend to have more offspring than dwarves and elves. A lot more than dwarves, actually. But less than orcs. Orcs are like full R selection, and they would be very aggressive. They wouldn't do a lot of careful planning. They wouldn't really have to. Their goal would be to get there with the biggest horde as possible, as fast as possible, and then just win. And so, what does all this mean? Well, I think what's interesting here is that in a lot of ways, just on the heels of Tolkien's my videos on Tolkien's battles from Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, he is very knowledgeable of warfare and such, in the sense of the unfolding of battles and other things. He does seem to leave some things that are curious, like why don't the dwarves use pole arms? Right now, maybe because they didn't, they got stomped by the Easterlings, and that explains their poor showing. But then that begs the question: since dwarves have been around since the First Age, why don't they use them? Because they're clearly at a disadvantage. Unless they just spent their times fighting in caves and just didn't bother leaving the caves, in which case I guess it wouldn't matter. They don't seem to move out of the caves very often, so maybe that's the argument. The elves, I don't really have much to say other than Tolkien left out their horsemanship, which I think is strange given how he puts elves in this exalted position with relationship to nature and animals. I think that would be a natural connection to make them the best horsemen in the realm, so to speak. I think Orcs and Uruk-hai, I agree pretty much. I only have slight additions to make to his stuff there. I think Shad's problem is twofold. He tries to amalgamate too many different fantasy traditions all into one. You can't do that because they're coming from very different places. You're just gonna have to pick one and just cut the Gordian knot. And my Gordian knot, I'm just gonna cut it and say it's Tolkien with some minor adjustments. And then his penchant for individual duels, which I guess might be exciting from a Hollywood movie perspective, but that's not how real battles are going to get fought. That's not how fantasy battles are going to get fought. Again, you might have one or two duels before a battle, but that's it. So, in that regard, I think that's what hurts his analysis. But it was an interesting idea, and so interesting that I decided to add my own contribution to it, of course. So, now, I could have included hobbits, I could have included, other classic fantasy races, kobolds, the undead, blah, blah, blah. That would have been a very long video. And hobbits don't really fight anyhow because they're too short. But other races that maybe aren't short could still fight. And then, of course, I left out men entirely because, of course, sky's the limit for how men might organize and fight in a fantasy setting. So I didn't want to, that could have been a video all on itself. So I just want to deal with the big three, that we all sort of know about. And how I think that there's a lot of room within fantasy, whether it's a game, a movie, a book series, where you could explore how these fantasy races might operate in a way that we don't typically associate. That's better tailored to their stated racial traits. Because again, we don't see elves being great horsemen, we don't see dwarves being great pikemen, and we don't see goblins using spears or pikes either. And I'm like, well, you're short. You'll need to close the distance somehow. Humans will just be able to thump you on the head and it's over. So in that regard, I feel like that this meta does need to move. It's sort of stuck, and so I hope all of this was entertaining and enlightening. And let's take a look at the chat. Reno Hayner, Shad is a cringe lord. How does a fat nerd with no fighting skills or serious study become an authority on anything? Well, it's called YouTube, and it's he plays the sort of likable he jester maxes. That's why people like him. Euthanasia. This should be interesting. Ha ha ha. Euthanasia. Now that you're thinking out the factions, when will we be getting the tabletop rules for this war game? I know, man. I know. That's I know that'd be great. Manoan, I know who Shadiversity is and what he does, but I'm not familiar with this item of his. Well, you should still watch him, Manoan. I mean, even though I've gently criticized it, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. So interesting that I wanted to add my own to it. Hello, Zero World. Hello, Record Deepness. Let's see here. Euthanasia. Using spears in tunnels underground wouldn't be fun. Well, you wouldn't have the room in many cases. Euthanasia. I could see above ground spears being that way above ground. Euthanasia. Dwarves with heavy drawbows would be good. Yeah. Props to C.S. Lewis. When I first read that, I'm like, I don't know about that. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, you're totally right, dude. C.S. Lewis is totally right on that. Minoan, I constantly forget the community tab exists on YouTube. Seems I've missed several posts, actually all from Todd. Yeah, communities is an important and helpful way to get in touch with people. Euthanasia. I see dwarves operating more like a Roman legion with shield wall and hammer or axe. Anonymous. Cave dwellers usually have bad eyesight, and why would dwarves have a culture of archery? Well, they wouldn't necessarily all live in the caves. You still have to leave. Well, the main reason why they'd have a culture of archery, Anonymous, is men and elves would just stomp them. They're like, a foot and a half or a foot taller. You're going to have to close the distance somehow, and archery is the way to do it. Manoa, and the Hobbit movies have dwarves riding warthogs, lol. Yeah, I'm not counting that, dude. Anonymous, and Shad is likely drawing more from D&D than Warcraft. I mean, I don't think the D&D dwarves are taller and stronger than men. That's more of a Warcraft thing, isn't it? Let's see here. Record deepness. Well, if the bad guys get wargs and the dwarves can have warthogs. Wow. No. Euthanasia. Orc equals everything is quantity over quality. Yes, with the exception of Uruk-hai, who would be the core shock troops. Let's see. Record deepness. So fighting orcs would be kind of like fighting the Chinese in the Korean War with mass attacks, trading bodies flying. Yeah, pretty much. And then like the Uruk-hai being like crack troops would be like the Red Guard or something. The actual well-trained divisions. Do orcs and Lord of the Rings have night vision? Euthanasia. I think they have an advantage in night because when I mentioned in the first Battle of Osgiliath, there was an orc raid at night into Lothlorien to cause a distraction for Smeagol to escape. So that was coordinated in order to help Smeagol escape the elvish clutches. So I think they have some propensity. Yeah, Euthanasia. In D&D, they are less strong, but are much more dexterous. No one. Where did Shadowfax come from? Was it the elves? The Marass. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember where the Rohan horses came from. Nathan C.J. Hood. No idea about this. It's interesting. Minoan war elephants are the best war mount. Yes, they are, but they're hard to come by. Unless it was somehow possible to make a war rhino. Wow. Nathan C.J. Hood. What if a war hippo? No. No hippos or warthogs or rhinos. Euthanasia. Minoan asks the real questions. Record deepness. Elves could also potentially domesticate other animals to supplement their numbers in a battle or skirmish. Yes. Yes. So you could see. Well, another medieval. This is not a something to do with war, but it has to do with medieval culture. Was falconry to like hunt. So presumably for the acquisition of provender, they could have falcons that they just kind of talk to. It's like, hey, go knock that pigeon out of the sky for me, or maybe like fly into the eyes of their enemies. So that could be. Euthanasia. Aren't elves more reclusive also? I guess it kind of depends on the elf. In the Silmarillion, they were a lot more aggressive and out in the open. They had a lot more vital energy. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, they're kind of dying out. Galadriel calls it the long defeat. So they have to be more cautious in that time period. Euthanasia would work more as mercenaries than a standing army, perhaps. You mean elves would be mercenaries? I'm not sure they'd be motivated by that kind of incentive. Nathan C.J. Hood. Minoan will offer amphibious combat. War hippos. No. Let's see. Record deepness. If you could talk to a bird, you could use it as a spotter for indirect missiles. Yeah, that's true. So elves could use their birds as reconnaissance, falcons or whatever. Yeah. Nathan C.J. Hood. How would trolls get on? Well, I didn't really prepare for trolls, but yeah, I could. Basically, trolls are really dumb. They're basically like the way I'd see trolls being used is like elephants, but smaller. So they're smaller than an elephant. They're kind of this relatively unintelligent shock troop. You'd probably give them like maces and hammers and axes and just charge them in to just smash a position. Fire and forget kind of thing. Don't pay too much attention. They'll either make it or they won't. But they'll do a lot of damage on the way. Record deepness. Imagine a raiding party of elven horse archers that could fire within line of sight without any chance of retaliation. Yes. Euthanasia. Or would dwarves use artillery pieces? And you say also, again, who would want to charge into a wall of wagons with ballista? Yeah, I think the dwarves would quite likely do that. Now, if you want to branch out a little bit and include gnomes, which are popularized with both D&D and Blizzard and World of Warcraft, gnomes tend to fill the tinkering role for dwarves and are sort of like a racial ally. So you could argue that maybe the gnomes are the ones making the ballistas, if you want to go that route. Because again, they're relatively small. They're not going to be fighters on the front lines. Wisconsin Kraut. Is there any reference to dwarves using crossbows? All of the Genoese. In Tolkien, there's no crossbows. That's more of a stylistic choice on his part. I don't think there's any reason to assume there wouldn't be. In fact, if there were catapults, and we read in the Siege of Gondor that Mordor did use catapults, it should be possible. Record deepness. We don't like gnomes here. Zero World, the Fall of Numenor book review when? Todd. I don't know if I'm going to do that. We'll have to see. But yeah, everybody, I guess that's all for tonight. So again, this was a response to Shadiversity, but also looking at Tolkien and orcs, elves, and dwarves, and how, given their racial traits, primarily as given to us by Tolkien, what fighting styles and weapons we would expect them to use in any sort of like fully fleshed out fantasy. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. It was just a light-hearted, fun stream. See you guys all tomorrow.